Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, Isis, Imitation of Life. The Goddess Next Door helps a young black girl overcome racism during the era of Jim Crow in this Golden Age Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Imitation of Life in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. I've been told by people that writing novels is better than writing comic books, and that being a novelist is better than being a comic book writer. Now, I really don't know about that because I'm a novelist and I'm a screenwriter. I'm also a blogger. And over the last 25 years, as I've written and published 8 novels, 6 nonfiction books, 2 screenplays, scripts for 2 seasons of a TV series, and 3 series of novelettes, and hundreds of articles on my blog, I have always held out hope that one day I'd finally get the opportunity to write a comic book. Now, I never thought that writing comics was this step down like some of these elitists in the literary world believe them to be. I never thought that novels were better than comic books. For me, comics, novels, and movie screenplays were all the same thing. They were stories. So I did not see a comic book as being a lesser story than a novel or a lesser story than a screenplay. Because to me, all 3 of them are different mediums, and all 3 of them have different approaches to story. And as I see it, one medium for storytelling isn't better than another. It's how the writer tells a story in that medium that makes it great. A great writer can use the same storytelling approaches in a comic book that they use in a novel, and they can use many of the great story elements like irony, foreshadowing, symbolism in a comic book the same way a novelist does in a novel or a screenwriter does in a screenplay. As I saw it, it was always the skill of the writer that made the story great, not the medium that they told the story in. Because if you take a bad novelist like an E.L. James, she can give you 50 Shades books that feature Mary Sue characters, convoluted storytelling, and cringeworthy dialogue. Whereas a great comic book writer like an Alan Moore can give us a Watchmen, or Chris Claremont can give us something great like the Phoenix Saga. So when you have a talented writer, they can go out here and take any medium and turn and produce a great story because they understand how that medium works and they know how to tell a story in that medium. So when I look at storytelling, I look at it as something that any writer can use to tell their stories. And again, one storytelling medium is no better than another because a skilled writer can tell a great story in each medium because they've learned how to work with that medium towards presenting a story that conveys their ideas, conveys their message, and makes something compelling for the audience. Because when you understand how the medium works, you can learn how to tell a great story. And when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I always saw storytelling like that when I was aspiring to be a comic book writer. I always saw each medium as a way to tell a great story. So when I aspired to be a comic book writer and I saw the industry starting to fall off in the mid-90s, I started learning about story from the novel, and I started learning about screenwriting in my late 20s to early 30s, and I learned how to tell stories in each of those mediums. And as I've learned how to work with all of those mediums, I learned the rules of those mediums, the structures of those mediums, and what I learned is you have to be able to wrap the form of a story around the structures of those rules. And that's something I learned working on the novel, and I learned working on the screenplay. And it's something that I learned that I think I could bring to the comic book, because I believe that the comic book um, medium is a great medium for storytelling. And I believe that in the hands of someone who understands the craft of storytelling, they could tell a great story in that medium. And what I've learned from my experience working with all three, the novel, the screenplay, and the comic book, is that each has a different approach. Now, some people believe that writing novels is hard, but it's not that hard at all. It's something that once you understand how you want to tell your story, you can tell it in the novel, but you have more real estate in a novel to work with than you would a screenplay or a comic book. Now, the novel, usually you have the most real estate of all to tell your story. You usually try to tell your story within the first 50 pages. Usually that's how you set up your main character, your main conflict, what the main character wants to do, what the obstacles are in their way, and most importantly, why we should care. So you have at least about 50 pages to get your novel started, and usually you have 50,000 to 75,000 words to tell your story. Now, the real challenge with the novel usually is making sure that you stay focused as you're writing that 50 to 75,000 words or even 100,000 words, and that your story stays on track. That's the main challenge of working in a novel. Now, the other forms of storytelling, the screenplay and the comic book, those are a little tougher as related to structure. Usually the structure isn't as fluid as the novel. Usually you have a lot of open space in a novel, but inside of a comic book and a screenplay, the structures are a little bit more rigid. Now with the screenplay, you usually have about 10 pages to set up your story, because each page in a screenplay is a minute, and in the screenplay you have to have lots of action. So you have to really condense your story in a screenplay so that you can introduce your main character, the conflict that they have to deal with and what they want, and why we should care within the first 10 pages of a story. Now, a comic book is very different in that you are dealing with writing different panels, and each panel you're writing tells a part of the story. So with a comic book, you are actually writing to describe pictures that the artist will interpret and draw into these pictures that will tell the story. So it's a very different model of storytelling, and it's a very condensed model of storytelling. It's actually, as I see it, a lot more concentrated than a screenplay. A screenplay, you have a little bit more fluidity because at least you have a page, but with the comic book, you have a panel, and you have to really concentrate as much story into each panel in that 22-page structure that you usually have. Now, that structure can be a little bit more fluid if you're doing a graphic novel. You might have 60 to 120 pages, but you have to really concentrate your story into those pictures so that they tell that story, and that the story moves from picture to picture in the comic book so that the reader can continue reading the comic, continue to turn pages, because in the visual medium of a comic book, what really makes the comic book story flow is making sure that the pictures move the story from page to page, and that the reader is compelled to keep reading from page to page. So when you're dealing with a comic book, it's a very, very different model than your screenplay, and it's a far different model than your novel, because with the novel, you have people imagining what they see inside their head, and with the screenplay, people have to take the actions of the characters and have a way to film them so that people can see them on screen. But with the comic book, you have to have the pictures that are written in a certain way so that the artist can interpret them, so that the story can be told in a way where everything flows in sequence from the first panel to the last panel. And that's why I say it's story is story, and that each medium has its own set of rules, and you have to understand how those rules work in order to tell the story. So when I look at comic books, I don't see them as lower than a novel or less than a novel, and I don't see screenplays as less than a comic book. I see them all as the same, and because I understand how much work goes into writing all three of them, and you have to understand how each of these story structures work before you can wrap the form around them. So that's the big challenge of writing in all three mediums, is understanding how you're going to form your story around the rules and the structures of all three. So that was something I have been learning over the last 20 years, working with the novel, working with the screenplay, in the hopes of eventually getting to the point where I could start writing comic books. And over the last 4 years, as I've worked with different artists like Bill Walko and Mike Williams on the covers for ISIS series books and books like The Legendary Mad Matilda and John Haynes' A Conversation with Death, I have started to learn how to write for the comic book, because all of those covers you see on those ISIS series books, or books like John Haynes' A Conversation with Death or The Legendary Mad Matilda, though all of those covers were designed based on concepts I wrote in storyboards and things I wrote in paragraphs. So all of my descriptions were what Bill Walko and Mike Williams used to make their interpretation of my ideas for those covers, and that's what enabled me to see that I could go out here and write comic books, because all the things that I do, all the story that I tell on those covers is what I would have to do for a comic book, because when you design a cover for a book, you have to tell a story in a single image. You basically have to concentrate the entire novel or novelette into a single compelling image that enables the readers to get their attention and will get them interested in reading the book. And that's what you really have to do when you're doing a comic book. You have to concentrate a lot of story into single images, and those single images have to move the story forward. And as I worked on these covers over the last 4 years, I started learning how to tell my stories in pictures, and that's what gave me the confidence to start working on the script adaptation of the ISIS series book, All That Glitters. So I took everything that I learned from writing novels and screenwriting and cover design, and over the last year I had started working on my first comic script. And with this ISIS All That Glitters comic script, what I wanted to do was concentrate all of the story I put into an ISIS series book into a comic book script, and have that script capture the essence and spirit of everything I would write either in a novel or a screenplay, and take the images that I usually imagine in my head and find a way to translate them into what an artist like a Bill Walko could use to make pictures for the story. So I wanted to take us from the prose style into the visual style, and I wanted to give people a translation of what an ISIS series book would come to life in pictures. So as I was writing the script, I studied everything I could about comics while I was working on the script and working on the book at the same time. I learned about different shots. I learned about different visuals, and I wanted to be able to give my readers eventually a graphic novel that was on the same level of craftsmanship of one of my ISIS series books. And that's what I want to offer my readers next year when I do the upcoming ISIS graphic novel Indiegogo. And one of those things I'm really looking forward to doing because it'll finally be an opportunity to finally see how one of my stories would be told in a comic book and to see how my storytelling model is translated from comic panel to comic panel, because oftentimes people have said that my stories like ISIS, the ISIS series books, and books like The Man Who Rules the World, they read like comic books, and it would be great to actually see one of my stories actually made into a comic book. And I believe that ISIS All That Glitters is the best book to start with working on writing comics, because this is a story that is a lot like the comics I grew up reading back in the late 70s and in the 80s and the early 90s, an all ages comic. And with this comic, I really want to give readers that action-packed old school style comic while putting a fresh take on the old school bank robbers comic book story that everybody used to read back in the day. So I really want to give people a really fun comic, a very entertaining comic, and this comic was at least about 25 years in the making. I had to learn a lot of different skills, and I had to apply a lot of different skills as I worked on this script. And as I see it, the way a good story is going to translate from one medium to the next. Because if you're a good writer, you can tell a great story, and that story can be translated from one medium to the next while staying true to the source material and staying true to the original spirit of the story. And one of the things I'm looking forward to next year is doing this Indiegogo and eventually seeing Bill Walko turn my words into the pictures I couldn't draw when I was 9 years old. And I would love to see this project get funded next year, because I would finally be able to share one of my stories in that comic book I wanted to write ever since I was 9 years old. And I would be finally able to hold one of my stories that I wrote in the form of the comic book I originally wanted to do ever since I was 9 years old, and the ISIS comic book I wanted to do way back in my 20s, because originally characters like ISIS, John Haynes, and Eastine, they were originally intended to be comic books, but because I could not break into the comic book industry, unfortunately due to the insular nature of it, I had to go in, and the state of the industry at the time, I had to go into trade publishing, and I had to learn about the business of publishing on my own. So I had to learn about the business of publishing before I could ever go into comics, but I've always wanted to do comics. I never saw comics as less than, because comics were my gateway to reading at 4 years old. They were the way I learned how to read different books, and they were the way of learning how to read. So I learned from comics. I don't see them as some sort of entertainment that's beneath the novel. I see them on the same level as the novel, and because I see it that way, I see it as a medium for telling stories, and I believe that in the hands of a great craftsman, you can get a great story And that great craftsman can work with forming that great story on that structure, whether it be a novel where he writes 50,000 words or 75,000 words to tell that story, a novelette like I usually do with the ISIS series where I take 10 to 15,000 words to tell a story, or a screenplay where they take this script and they write a script where they can film this same story. I believe that with each medium you can tell that same story. There may be some minor cosmetic changes here and there, but a craftsman can tell that same story on 3 different mediums and stay true to the message they wanted to convey, stay true to the ideas they wanted to present, and stay true to what they want to present in that story and the message they want to present in that story. I believe a skilled craftsman can make any story work in any medium, and that's one of the things I really want to show with this upcoming ISIS series Indiegogo, is that an ISIS series story can translate from the novelette to the comic book, and that it's my skill as a writer that makes that story work from the medium, whether it be a novel or a screenplay or even something like an ISIS graphic novel. The upcoming ISIS Indiegogo is going to launch in early 2019, and you can pick up ISIS series books on Amazon.com right now by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to take a look at the first 10 pages of the upcoming ISIS graphic novel, ISIS All That Glitters script, you may do so by clicking the link to my blog. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers from SJS Direct, ISIS, House of Isis. The goddess next door takes on a hustling Hotep high priestess in Harlem in this Afrocentric ISIS series adventure. Pick up ISIS, House of Isis at online booksellers today.